With a 10mm, remove these two nuts that hold the engine cover on. All right, remove this cover, pop these open, and slide your inlet for the air filter housing out of the way. Now disconnect the mass airflow sensor and pop the connectors off. There's another connector down here. All right, disconnect that. This hose, remove the hose clamp and twist it off. Set that aside. And now disconnect the throttle body. With a 10mm, loosen up this clamp here. You don't have to remove it or anything, you just have to loosen it up. And then another 10mm bolt here, remove that. And another one right here. Now you can take this whole intake assembly and wiggle it up and out of your way. There are 4 bolts holding this throttle body on. All 4 are 10mm. Remove them. All right, and now what I want to do is just simply take it, set it aside over here, out of my way. I just wanted to disconnect it from the rest of the intake. There's a clip holding this wiring harness in place. Lift that up. Just pop it up and out. There we go. Set that aside and unplug this connector here. Set that aside. There's a harness connector here that's going to have to get disconnected. All right. I'm just going to leave it like that, but it is disconnected. Remove this hose here. It should have a hose clamp. This one has half of one. And unplug this connector. All right, set those aside. This hose can stay on the intake. There's a bolt right here, 12mm. Remove that. There's another one right over here. Take that one out as well. And last but not least, one over here. Okay, all 3 of these are the same, so you don't have to worry about mixing them up. One more hose on this driver's side that has to come off. Squeeze the clamp, pull that down, and then you can pull the hose right off. So these Allen head bolts here are 8mm. Mine were super rusty, so I had to beat the socket on with a hammer. Okay, there's one. I'm working my way from the inside out. There's number 2. Number 3. I have 2 nuts, one on each end. They're supposed to be 12mm nuts. Mine are no longer 12, so I hammered on an 11. Okay, came off with the stud. That's fine. Ideally, it would just be the nut. And same thing on the back side. All right, I hammered on an 11 in the back as well. And the nut has been removed and of course will be replaced. I have a shop vac and I want to vacuum up all this rust and dust, debris, everything that's here, because as soon as we take this part of the intake off, the holes for the runners are wide open and anything that falls down in there will fall right into the engine, and that is not good. I'm going to lift this intake up, and there are still a couple things connected to it. Wiggle it off the stud back here. In the front, my nut came off with the stud, but in the back, the stud stayed. So it's stuck on there. I'm going to try and pry this harness off, being very gentle. These two coolant lines have to come off. I pried them off with my pry bar. There's a little clip. It's really hard to show, but basically at the bottom of this retainer, there's a clip that you have to press down on. So there's another electrical connector back there. There's just a secure tab that you have to disconnect. I'll show you once the intake is off. I'm gonna lift it up straight just to clear that stud in the back. Now this can come up and out. So what I was talking about, these two here, they get clipped on. This one has a little tab at the top and this one up underneath, and they get clipped on to these two retainers here. So you just have to unclip them with your nail and then pry them off or push them off, whatever you need to do. We have to take off this lower intake too, and as you can see, it is completely stuffed with leaves, debris, and all sorts of junk that doesn't need to be there, or shouldn't be there, I guess I should say. So I'm going to vacuum all that out. I'm going to pop up this harness here. You can use a trim tool, some needle nose pliers, a pry bar, whatever you have. And then I'm going to use these pliers to pop up the injectors, squeeze the tab and disconnect it. There's 3 on each side. Usually needle nose pliers help you get a grip on that little tab. All right, now with this out of the way, we can do the same thing to this side. Okay, pop that up and disconnect the injectors. Okay. Perfect. Pop out. Pop this one out as well. There you have it. And just so I can get extra slack in the harness, I'm going to disconnect these 2 connectors. There we go. Now this harness can pull out of my way to the side. Let's do the same to the other side. disconnect the VVT solenoid and the cam sensor. And then pop the harness out of its retainer over here. And now this can slide out of your way more. You don't have to do this step, but it helps. Next, I'm going to disconnect the fuel line, pop up this cap, press on this tab. There's one on the back one here and one on the back side. Press both of those and pull the fuel line off. There we go. Fuel will come out. Set this aside and out of your way. Now go around and remove all the 12mm bolts that hold this intake on. Okay, let's see. Another one right here. And another one here. Now there's 4 more bolts, and you need a special torque socket for that. It's the temper torque socket with the hole in the middle. And I'm gonna go ahead and break these free. And the reason I'm doing these by hand is because these special torque sockets, because they have a hole in them, they are actually weaker, and I don't want to use the air gun and damage the socket. Now take off these 3 bolts that hold the fuel rail on. And I'm doing that because I can't get to this bolt. And I guess I can get to that one, but I have to take this off for this one. Okay, now I can move this to the side. Now we can continue and remove this. Oh! Wow, that was tight. Okay, make sure that's in there. Oh, okay. Now that those are all loose, I'm gonna remove them all. I'm gonna put these 3 bolts back just because I don't want this flopping around. I don't want the injectors popping out. I don't have new injector O-rings, so I want these seated at all times. All I have to do is move the fuel rail a little bit. Okay, pried it up on this side. Break it free on the other side as well. And now pull this up and out. Be careful of any debris. You don't have to, if you want to disconnect this, you can. This is just the return hose for the fuel. Okay, squeeze on the 2 tabs. And pull the hose off. Now you can remove your lower intake. So at the back of the engine here, between the firewall and the engine, if you follow the coolant tubes from the top, you'll see that there's a bracket that leads down here, and there's a bolt that holds it on, and the bolt is really hard to get to, but you have to remove that in order to be able to remove these coolant pipes. And it's a 10mm nut on a stud, and you'll need a swivel and a little extension to get to it. Once you have your socket locked on it, you're gonna try and break it free. And here's the nut. Now the bracket can finally come free. Now with these electrical connectors popped off of the bracket unbolted, you may or may not have to remove the stud that's sitting down there. As you can see, the bracket is now moving. So let's go back up top and try to pull these coolant pipes out. So to disconnect this crossover tube, there's two brackets here. Both of them have a 10mm nut on the bottom of it. You can't really see it very well, but if you follow it with your socket, it should fall right on. Remove those. Oops, I dropped that one. I'll have to get it with a magnet. Remove this one as well. Can't see it. Oh, there we go, I'm on it. Okay. Looks like I dropped both of those in there, but that's all right. I can get those with a magnet. So from here on, these pipes are connected, and in order to remove both of them, you actually have to take both of the heads off. So we're not going to do that. What I will do is cut the bracket here and the bracket here, separate these two. This will be able to come off. So this will be able to come off by itself, and that's going to allow us to get to the knock sensors, which are underneath. To do that, I'm going to use this cutting tool and cut it here. I'm going to put a rag in these holes here for the cylinders. That way no debris or metal shavings make its way in there. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these. Okay, so this one's cut, separated here. Now let's separate this one in the back. Okay, so as you can see, these are now separated, which is perfect. I can take this tube and slide it out. And here's your tube. Now you have access to replace the knock sensors. Now with this out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and vacuum all of this. As you can see, there's a whole lot of leaves in there and a potential little mouse nest. So take all of that out, vacuum it or scoop it, do whatever you want to do, but make sure it's clean. So now you have two knock sensors, one here, depending on which one you have to replace. Replace the appropriate one. I'm replacing this one here. So to disconnect the electrical connector, it'll be easier with a pair of needle nose pliers. Just gently squeeze it and pull it away. And now with a 12mm socket or wrench, break free the bolt. Remove it all the way, and then you can remove the knock sensor. Now, when you remove it, keep in mind in which position it is, so it's facing with the connector that way. It's important that you put it back exactly the same way it came out, because as you may or may not know, these pick up on vibrations from the engine. So remove the bolt, and here's your old knock sensor. Take your new knock sensor and the bolt, put it through. I cleaned up the threads, that way it can engage properly. And again, like I said prior, make sure you face it the right way. Thread this on all the way, and once it's bottomed out, we'll go ahead and torque it. Okay, and get the torque wrench. Torque this to 15 foot-pounds. It's important that you torque this right because it helps to read the vibrations from the engine correctly. Right there, perfect. Now go ahead and plug this in. All right, I didn't hear it very loud, but make sure that it's clicked in. You want it secured, because if this comes loose on you, well, you're gonna have to get down here again and disconnect it. Now with a rag, I'm going to clean out all this junk that's in here, because the next thing I want to do is put this crossover pipe in. So just go ahead and wipe everything down, make sure it's nice and clean. And I do suggest that you replace these O-rings, but if they're in good condition, I guess you can reuse them, but just keep in mind that getting to this is not easy if you ever have to replace them because of leakage. Since we're on the topic of cleaning, same goes for these two intake gaskets. You'd want to remove them and preferably replace them, clean off underneath, just scrape off any sort of debris that's there, make sure that the new gasket has a good seal. Make sure that the new gasket has a good area to seal up against. If you don't have new gaskets, you can reuse them, but like I said before, keep in mind it's not easy to get to this, so do whatever you have to do, but make sure this seals up. You don't want any air leaks into the intake. So what I want to do now, I don't want to just put this pipe in and leave it disconnected from this one. There's a reason why they were on the bracket, and that's for vibration. You don't want this to come loose or start leaking. So what I'm going to do is fish this back in and make sure it's going the right way. By the way, I cleaned up the area there, as well as on here, as well as on the pipe. Press this on all the way. Make sure it's fully bottomed out. And I'm going to take a hose clamp that's large enough to go around both of these pipes. Fish it back out. Start it on. And before I fully tighten it, I'm going to get it close, but before I fully tighten it, I have this piece of rubber that I'm going to put in between these two pipes, because I don't want to just tighten them together and have them rub up against each other. I want something to take up the space and dampen vibrations. So basically I'm remaking these two clamps. If you have a welder, you might be able to tack weld these together, but if you don't, you can also do it this way. See, like you could just go zip and tack weld it right there. That might be a little more difficult, but that's why I have this piece. And now with that in, I'm going to go ahead and tighten my clamp. All right. That's seated in there. Make sure that this piece is turned the way it's supposed to. And if you wish, you could put another clamp up front here. There we go. Make sure these are secured together. Perfect. Now you can reinstall the nut for this bracket and make sure it's nice and snug. There we go. Make sure you reconnect your electrical connections and they're secure. A little trick to installing these studs, or any hardware if you need it to stay on your socket, is to put a little bit of electrical tape, and then you can guide it down and start it onto the threads. Okay, there we go. That one's nice and tight. Let's do the same to the one in the rear. All right, make that nice and snug. Perfect. Get your socket off, and don't forget to take off the electrical tape. Now let's tighten up these nuts. Nice and snug. All right, that's nice and tight. I'll double check this rear one. Perfect. I'm going to reinstall this hose. I put a new hose clamp on it because the old one was in very poor condition. Make sure the hose is fully seated before this gets fully tightened. All right, that's nice and snug. Now I'm going to take this entire assembly here, bring it over, and this hose was connected to that lower pipe. I'm going to slide that clamp on. Just like that. And now you can take this, line it up with this top hose. Now slide in this housing. This stays up here. Line it up with all of its bolt holes. You can start in a couple of the bolts. And some that are down here. There's 3 down here. This one in the back here is a little tricky to get in because you can't really see it. All right, so now that they're all started, let's snug them up. Okay, I'm going to check these by hand, make sure they're nice and tight. Okay. Perfect. Okay, now that they're all nice and tight, let's get the thermostat back on. That was being held by these 3 nuts. Snug these up as well. Okay, let's double check these, make sure those are tight. Be careful with these because they break easily. Yep. Tight. And tight. Perfect. Now, if you have new gaskets, go ahead and reinstall those. Then you can slide the intake in, or the lower intake, I guess. Make sure it lines up with the dowel pins. Make sure it's seated. I'm going to loosen up these bolts. What that's going to do is allow me to get to the ones that are straight down underneath, because I have to move the fuel rail to the side. All right, now, so you have this Torx bit that had the little dowel pin on the inside of it. Those, there's only 4 of them, and they go here, here. It's important that you put them in the right hole, and you can't really put it in the wrong one because the other ones have deeper threads, so these won't engage in the threads. There was one over here. I'm just making sure that they fully start. Perfect. And one all the way in the back. And since I'm putting in these bolts, I'm going to go ahead and put on the other ones as well. Oh, there's one. Okay, now that those are all started, let's snug them all up. I'm going to start with these temper Torx. Bottom those out. You'll notice I started from the center and worked my way out. Oops. I did that so that the intake can fully seat, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the other bolts. Those are 12 millimeter. Again, I'm going to stay in the center and work my way out. Now let's torque them all. Okay, I'm going to torque all these to 21 foot-pounds, starting in the center, working my way out. This one. All right, now I'll do the Torx. Come on, go in there. And last one. Awesome. Now before we finalize this part, let's get the fuel rail back on. Start all the bolts in by hand, that way you don't cross-thread them by accident. And snug them all up. Perfect. Go ahead and plug in your fuel line. Make sure it clicks. There we go. You have to press really hard on it. Make sure it clicks. You definitely don't want that coming loose because it'll spray fuel everywhere once you start it. Same with the return. Whoops. Okay, that's secured. Put these two securing caps back on. This will ensure that it really doesn't come off. Lock it down. Perfect. Now let's reconnect all the injectors back. Okay. Perfect. Secure the wiring harness back to where it was. Same on this side. I'm going to plug in the sensors up here, up front. Make sure they all click into place. Whoa. There we go. Secure the harness. Don't forget about this hose here. Press it on all the way. And lock in the clamp. Perfect. Now go ahead and slide this intake on. Line it up with the two studs. If any of your studs came out, go ahead and put them back in. And get this out of the way here. Make sure these brackets line up with their mounting locations. Make sure you're not crushing any wires or hoses down there. So if anything came loose in the process, put it back where it belongs. All right. Everything looks good here. I'm going to plug this in and install the two nuts on these two studs. There's one here and one that's kind of hard to see, but it's all the way in the back. All right, and now there were these 4 Allen head bolts. Those have to go right down here in the middle. Now let's snug them all up and torque them. I'm going to start in the middle and work my way out. Start with these Allen bolts. There we go. I'm not making them very tight, I'm just snugging them. And then the 2 nuts on the ends. Okay. Now let's torque all these to 21 foot-pounds as well. I'm gonna go in a sort of a cross pattern, but still staying in the middle, just to seat the gasket properly. Oh. And lastly, the 2 12mm nuts. Okay, perfect. Now is a good time to reattach the throttle body. If you have a new gasket, go ahead and install that. If not, at least make sure the old one is still in decent condition. It's not ripped or cracked. And snug it up. I'm going to check it by hand to make sure that it's properly tightened. Don't go too tight on these because they'll break. Okay, perfect. Go ahead and connect that. Make sure it clicks. Don't forget to reconnect this hose and secure it with the clamp. Go ahead and reinstall these 3 retaining bolts for the intake. There's one at the front, and then 2 on the back side here, or I guess this would be on the side. And snug them all up. Reconnect this electrical connector, make sure it clicks, and the hose. And make sure, like I said earlier, that all the other ones are secured. Reinstall the rest of your air intake, but make sure that you reconnect this hose here. It goes right in between these 2 little plastic tabs, and this is important. This is your fuel pressure regulator. So if you don't connect this, you'll have fueling issues. Now press it onto the throttle body. Make sure it's bottomed out completely. Go ahead and reinstall this hose and resecure it with the clamp. I'm going to connect the mass airflow sensor. Make sure it clicks. Now I'll get these 2 bolts. Now get your 2 bolts and start them on. There's one here and one at the back. Snug them up. Take your air filter housing. When you put it on, make sure that these 2 hooks slide into those 2 grooves. Otherwise it won't be locked in at the back and it'll open up. All right, lock it in up front. And one last thing is to tighten up this clamp. You don't have to go very tight on this. You just make it snug, just so that it seals up. These will easily break if you over tighten them. Last but not least, reinstall your engine cover. It's got 2 little hooks back there. Make sure those are in. And reinstall your 2 nuts. Snug them up. Okay. At this point, you want to turn on the engine and run it. Make sure you have no check engine lights. Make sure it's running smoothly. If for some reason there's something wrong, go ahead and double check your work. And other than that, take it for a road test.